Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus. Dear Sarah, hello, my name is Pete and I'm 42 years old and I would like to share my Bigfoot encounter with you, if I may. I appreciate remaining anonymous because it's a big deal for me to keep this sort of story hush-hush. Well, as I said, I'm a hog hunter and I love hunting hogs, but I'm very particular about my hunting practices. I do not hunt hogs with dogs, nor do I set up traps to kill hogs at point-blank range, because for me that defeats the whole purpose of hog hunting. I like a big challenge, and hunting hogs by killing them with a clear shot in between the eyes is the kindest way to take the animal, but also the most challenging. I also have some strict rules with my hog hunting. First of all, the hog I shoot must be big enough to have had some sort of a quality of life. I also prefer to take down male hogs rather than female hogs for obvious reasons. However, there's one very big problem when it comes to these animals. They are clever, fast, and feisty. If they detect a slight movement or a whiff of your scent, they'll be off like lightning and very difficult to approach again because their senses become very heightened. Another problem with a hog is they can be extremely aggressive and literally charge you if you're not careful. Where I live, we have had major problems with hogs because they have been damaging the environment by eating all the tubers and everything. They can cause a lot of damage. There's just too many of them running around, but my code of ethics never changes with my hunting practices regardless. Every time I go hog hunting, I get up at the crack of dawn before the sun rises and do my level best to be as quiet as possible. I used to hunt with a friend of mine, but he was always so clumsy and made so much noise, we never got a fair shot at a hog because they always ran away. These days I prefer to go shooting for hogs alone. I always look for fresh droppings and markings in the soil, as well as fresh muddy marks on branches where the hogs love to rub their derrieres, so to speak. My secret weapon to catching hogs is approaching them with stealth and making sure I have not been seen. On the day I had my Bigfoot encounter, it was a cool summer's day, and luckily there was a decent breeze, which was to my advantage because I would move in unison with the rustling of the leaves. On this particular day, I had the hog I wanted to shoot in sight. He was a hefty, sizable fellow, and I was able to take him down in seconds. He never knew a thing. I rushed over to my prize with a feeling of elated glee, already imagining the friend I would invite for pig on the spit with cornbread, beer, and of course mac and cheese. Sorry, I had no intention of making your listeners drool at the thought of crisply crackling and meat that melts in your mouth like butter. I immediately picked up my mobile to tell my wife the good news. I got one down, I told her proudly. You can invite your friends for a party on the patio. I then proceeded to thank my hog for the gift of his life, which is something I always do, and then I started to skin him straight away. There's a good reason I do this. Number one, it's easy to carry an animal that's been gutted because these hogs can be very heavy. And number two, I really need to remove the innards, especially the bladder, because should the bladder burst, it could contaminate the meat and it will taste not very nice. Luckily, I'm a skilled butcher and I made a fast work of skinning and gutting the hog. I put the innards in a bucket along with the bladder and intestines, liver and kidneys, etc., etc. I then strung the ham and hung the 2 hams on the tree, and then I proceeded to make a couple of journeys to my jeep. When I came back to my gutting spot to retrieve my cooler and the 2 hams, I was horrified to find everything gone except my empty cooler lying on the ground. The first thought that came into my mind was that some coyotes had retrieved my meat, but then what about the hams that were hung at 5 foot above the ground? None of this made any sense to me. Then it dawned on me that some lazy hunter had come and pinched my kill. This made me as mad as hell, because there are so many hogs out here. Why would anyone be so mean as to steal my kill? OMG, I thought, this is crazy. Who would do this? Is there not an unwritten code of ethics among us hunters? To say I was disappointed in human nature is not an understatement. Suddenly I had this airy feeling that I was not alone. I could feel eyes on me. It's hard to explain, but you know you're being watched. I looked around the thick brush to see if I could spot anything, but I couldn't see anything. Then I heard this deep guttural growl that was so scary I almost jumped out of my skin. I looked around again and then I saw it. It was huge. It was covered with deep brown, dirty red hair that was matted and nasty looking. But it wasn't a bear, it was bipedal though, but it wasn't human, nor was it an ape, but possibly a mixture of both species. It stood at about 9 foot tall, with the most enormous torso, 3 feet across, that positively rippled with muscles. I knew this creature could literally just rip off my head in seconds. It was like coming up against King Kong. I was defenseless because I just froze to the spot. The eyes of the creature bored into mine. I felt as he was looking into the depths of my soul. Run, run, I told myself, but my body just would not move. Once again the creature made a deep guttural warning growl and snarled at me. Suddenly I heard a chattering noise. Oh, please God, I thought, not another one, please no. Luckily the creature was distracted. He grunted and turned around to chatter to the other creature. It seemed like they had a language. I took this opportunity to run like the wind as fast as I could. The adrenaline surged through my body and my heart was pounding through my chest as I bolted back to my car, jumped in, started the engine, and drove away as fast as I could. When I got home, I told my wife to cancel the party because a hunter had stolen my hog. What is the world coming to? She sighed. I've never told a solitary soul my story until now, but my world has definitely changed since I met with Bigfoot. I hope you guys enjoyed my story. It was in the fall of 1995 when I had my Bigfoot encounter in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, which is where I live. I was 22 at the time and I still lived with my parents, who lived in a small house on a few acres of natural forest. As I was getting older, I wanted my own place, but to still live in close proximity to my parents. So I asked my father if I could build a tree house further in the forest that I could call my own abode, so to speak. I had the perfect spot in mind, 3 very strong redwood trees of extensive size in a prime position that overlooked a pretty little creek, rolling hills and ubiquitous trees. It would mean I would have great views of natural wildlife. What was there not to like? I also wanted to make the access to the house as discreet as possible, with little steps built into the tree that were not very visible to the naked eye. In other words, I wanted to be living in a home 100 feet off the ground that hopefully nobody knew was there. My father was not keen about the treehouse idea, especially the part of discreet access. You would need a proper staircase up and down the tree for shopping and so forth, he explained. My mother agreed with my father and would have much preferred a sensible option of me choosing to have a cabin or cottage in the woods. The idea of a relatively inaccessible treehouse did not score many brownie points with her. In a few years' time you'll regret it, she warned me. You are young and impractical, full of these novel, contrary ideas that will be short-lived once you get older and wiser. My father agreed, but finally, after much persuasion, he agreed that I could build a treehouse, much to my delight. My best friend, Casey, so happened to be in the treehouse business that was starting to increase in popularity in North America, so I had the best man to help me for the job. Like my dad, Casey was not keen about my discreet steps up to the tree idea. but he finally relented to my eager pleas and helped me design the perfect treehouse. Once it was finished, it had everything I could have ever asked for, and more than anything, it was the perfect man cave for me, with all the mod cons, anything a bloke could ever need. Even my parents thought the treehouse was a work of art. When you got to the top and gazed out of the large glass windows, you would see the most spectacular views for miles around. Every morning when I would wake up, I would make a steaming cup of hot coffee and just sit there with my binoculars and observe all the wildlife. I began to see birds I'd never seen before, and animals that are sometimes so reclusive they are rarely seen by humans, like a black panther and a mountain lion. I loved the peace and serenity of my new life, and of course the independence it brought me. One morning when I looked out of my window, I saw a herd of deer dashing away from the creek. Something had clearly terrified them, and I wondered what it could be. I felt a sense of growing excitement stirring within me, like you would get on a wildlife safari when you see the lion stalking its prey. That was the kind of feeling I had. I waited for a while and I saw nothing, and just when I was about to give up my viewing to make another cup of coffee, my eyes suddenly caught a glimpse of movement coming from some dense-looking shrubbery that I knew to be filled with thorny bushes. Surely nothing could come through that, I thought. You'd have to have rhino skin to get through those sharp needles without it shredding your skin to pieces. Yet again I saw movement, and a black hazy blur came barging speedily through the thick undergrowth with brute force. What on earth was that, I wondered. Then I saw it. At first I really did not know what I was looking at, because this thing, whatever it was, looked like a mass of black dredgelocks. What the heck is that, I wondered, as the creature stood up on two thick legs that supported a massive torso, shoulders and chest. I noticed the arms were way too long to be human, and the creature possessed hands, not paws. I immediately put on my binoculars to get a better view of the strange creature, the likes of what I have never seen before. I focused my lens on the creature, and I could see a cone-shaped head perched directly on the shoulders, bypassing any obvious need for a neck. The face was human-like but not human, and ape-like but not ape. It was as if this creature was a blend of great ape and human DNA. Then it hit me like a tornado of otherworldly revelation. No, surely not, I argued with myself. It just can't be. Memories came flooding back of a boy I knew in school, whom I had made fun of and ridiculed because he told me he'd seen a Bigfoot, and I had mocked him and teased him for his whimsical naivety. Now I was the one with egg all over my face. The creature in my lens was in no uncertain terms a Bigfoot. It could not be anything else, and it was as if the creature had stepped out of cryptozoology myths and legends into a blatant, clear and vivid reality. Bigfoot was real. I suddenly felt ashamed for the know-it-all mentality I had adopted throughout my school years. Now I began to realize that I did not know very much at all. I watched the creature as he moved with such fluidity, and as he walked, every stride he took was huge. It really was like watching a top predator moving with incredible grace. I marveled that something this gargantuan could move like this, and it was truly mesmerizing to watch. Then suddenly, like a jet plane about to take off, this creature leapt out of my view with an incredible speed, as if he'd revved up his engine and was gaining more momentum on the ground and was about to take off. I could not see the creature anymore, but I knew that he was in hunt mode and was probably chasing the herd of deer I had seen moments before. It seemed like seconds passed, and the Bigfoot came into view again, and I suddenly realized he was chasing after wild hog that I know from experience can be extremely aggressive. This was a wild goose chase if ever I saw one. I thought he had been after a herd of deer, but he had clearly stumbled across some wild hog along the path and was now changing tactics. Like a lion, he pounced on the creature, holding him down with his great girth in a crushing blow. I knew the hog must have been screaming, and I was glad not to be near enough to hear it. The Bigfoot, using one massive arm that bubbled with muscle, tossed a 400-pound hog in the air like it was a pizza. It landed on the ground with an almighty crush. If the hog wasn't dead before, it was definitely dead now, I thought. I watched the Bigfoot throw the limp body over his shoulders. Then he walked away into the undergrowth, leaving the way that he had come. It took me a long time to adjust to what I'd seen. Then I knew I had to make amends with my school friend I had relentlessly teased at school all those years ago for believing in these cryptid creatures that I now knew without a shadow of a doubt. This Bigfoot was real. "Hello," came the voice at the end of the line. "Bruce speaking." "Hey buddy, it's Dwayne from high school. Do you remember?" "Yeah," he said, "I remember you." "I phoned to apologize, buddy." "About what?" came the surprised voice. "Remember how I teased you at school about believing in Bigfoot?" "Oh yeah, that." "Well, you were right. He's real." "You've seen him too?" came Bruce's startled voice. I proceeded to tell him what had transpired in the last few minutes, and I could tell by the animated response that he was still as passionate about Bigfoot as he had always been. The biggest irony of all was that he was studying to be a cryptid zoologist. "Do you mind if I come over to your place?" he asked eagerly. "I'd like to see where it all happened and to take a look to see if there's any evidence." "Of course," I said. "I'm sure you know a lot more than I do, buddy," I said. "I must say I'm still in awe with what I've just seen, and more curious than ever." "That's what happens to a lot of people," said Bruce. "Once they've seen a Bigfoot, it changes everything, and people just become passionate about the creature, or so terrified that they never want to see it again. Either way, they are always curious to know more about the hairy man." "Why do you think that is?" I asked. "Well, I think people love mysteries for starters," he said. "I know I do. And then there is the humanness to consider. I think the humanness about this creature that fascinates us because it kind of makes the creature relatable to us." After a long conversation with Bruce, he arrived at my property within the hour, and I could see by the flushed look on his face that he was very excited to retrace the Bigfoot's movements that I had seen earlier. We wasted no time in examining the area with a fine-tooth comb, and we found the bloody spot where the hawk had been flung to the ground. We noticed the ground was too dry and hard for any footprints of the creature, and so that was disappointing. Yet we could detect the rank odour or vile afterglow that hung in the air that is often associated with a Bigfoot encounter. We walked deeper into the woods, and Bruce told me to listen. "I cannot hear anything," I said. "That's my point. It's usually quiet when Bigfoot is around," said Bruce. "All the animals go quiet. Even the birds stop singing." As we walked into the woods, I had a distinct feeling we were being watched, and I knew that Bruce was feeling it too. It was like a gnawing feeling in your gut that is so unsettling that it brings on feelings of extreme nausea. I just knew I needed to leave, and that is what we did. We ended up having coffee up in my treehouse, and Bruce told me my treehouse was the most perfect place to spot a Bigfoot. All these years later, I live in my treehouse with my wife, but we have made some adjustments, like putting up a really great staircase that winds its way up to the tree and makes it much easier for access. I did see the Bigfoot one other time, but it was so brief. But I keep on watching, waiting and hoping for another encounter with the elusive hairy man. Bruce, the guy I teased mercilessly at high school, is now my very best friend. Isn't life ironic? And as for my fascination for Bigfoot, that increases every single day. I hope you enjoyed my story. Dear Sarah, and all your listeners, my Bigfoot encounter happened here in Mississippi, recently in early June of this year. I'm sure many of your listeners will identify with the fact that 2020 has been such a challenging year for us. With the COVID-19 virus, all our lives have been turned upside down. Naturally, because of the COVID virus, I was doing most of my work from home on the computer. I was so lucky because I was never entirely alone. I enjoyed the company of my two beautiful dogs, Bully Boy, who is a min pin, and Noah, my golden retriever. One night at about 10 p.m, my golden retriever threw up violently in my bedroom, and so I let him out of doors, and to my surprise he went and lay in some bushes, like animals do when they're about to die. I was surprised that he never came back indoors, because that was not at all like him. The next morning, Noah was still lying in the bushes, and that made me very concerned. However, when Noah saw me, he was so excited and his tail was wagging, but he settled down and stayed in the bushes, which I thought was odd. I decided I would take him to the vet in the next few minutes. and when I returned to the bushes to get my dog, it was too late. He had already passed away. I was absolutely devastated. Losing a pet that is part of the family is the most devastating thing for anyone. However, with Noah, there were no warning signs apart from the jippy tummy in the evening, and the next day he's dead as a dodo. How can that happen? You just feel this total emptiness that cannot be filled, and like the death of someone you love, it rarely makes you feel totally numb. I have known people who've been so bereaved at losing a pet that they absolutely refuse to get another one because they cannot stomach going through that kind of pain again. I do know where they're coming from, but then again, without animals in our lives, I believe we would miss out on so much. My country home did not feel the same without my beautiful dog, and I really did not know how to deal with my grief. In early January, I had lost 2 members of my family that I loved dearly, and losing Noah was the final straw. I do not know how other people deal with their grief, but for me, going for a walk with my dog Bully was the only way to get any perspective. Why did life have to be this cruel, I wondered? Why was there such a horrendous thing called death? Why is it inevitable that someday the same fate awaits us all? Where was Noah now, I wondered? Had he met up with all my previously deceased pets in heaven? Was he now in another realm? Was God taking care of him, I wondered. There were so many questions flowing through my head that I had no answers for. I did wonder if when we die, whether we really do finally get all the answers to all the questions. I sincerely hope we do. When I'm sad, there is a secret valley that I go to on my own land that borders on some national forest. I go there to meditate on my grief, collect my thoughts, have a really good cry, and come to the realization that life can be beautiful despite the pain, and maybe because of it. Without pain, we really would not appreciate the joy that we have in our lives as much as we do. So more about the secret place that is truly my own. It's a tiny little spot on my land with a beautiful creek surrounded by a large expanse of rocky alcoves, one that goes up to about 50 feet, and from there gushes the most magnificent waterfall. I love to just sit on some large flattened boulders and listen to the gushing water and watch the white foaming spray caress the rocks. So on this particular day, carrying my grief like a heavy piece of baggage, I wanted to unload. I went to the creek armed with a thermos of hot coffee and with my dog Bully, and that was it. I sat there for hours just blankly staring into space and watching the world around the little creek go by, almost as if this little bubble I was in was all there was. And for that moment, it was comforting. I allowed my attention to focus on the little things like a dragonfly flying across the water like a tiny fairy, and a little frog eating a fly. It was all very beautiful, I thought. I listened to the bird song and a chorus of crickets that were clearly unaware that it was way too early to be singing. On this day, I was focusing on everything with an intensity that is rare for me, like a little ant that scurried across my skin, and a curious squirrel darting up the tree, watching me with a keen interest. Hours seemed to me to melt away like butter does on a hot tin roof. I knew it was getting later, but I didn't care. I was in no hurry, and I wanted to just enjoy this perfect place for as long as I could with my adorable Minpin, who was curled up beside me. The pain in my heart for my pet's demise was raw, palpable, and painful. I truly felt I had been physically stabbed. That is how poignant my grief was. After a while, I found myself staring at a tree blankly, as I had been staring at everything all day, with that heightened, unintentional focus. The girth of the part of the tree looked almost moss-like and furry. It looked like something was clinging to the tree, I thought. Without thinking, I picked up a pebble and threw it at the mossy part of the tree, and my pebble hit the moss. It was a perfect shot. In that moment, the moss separated from the tree, and I saw a giant pair of arms, a big torso, and a slender, strong pair of legs forming before my very eyes. I was in shock because I had not really expected there to be an animal clinging to the tree. It was crazy because the creature had not even flinched or reacted to the pebble that I had thrown. It truly would have remained stuck to the tree and I wouldn't have even known it was there. It was like a chameleon because it was so superbly camouflaged to the tree, and its brown hair was the most perfect match. I wondered how long the creature had been clinging to the tree. Had he or she been watching me all this time, I wondered? But what was this creature? I had never seen anything like it in all my life. I would say the creature was about 7 foot and 500 pounds. He had long arms like a monkey, but he had human hands, and the head shape was like a rounded cone, but the face was long and human-like, and his brown eyes appeared to be intelligent and observant. The creature had a look of surprise on his face, almost as if he was in disbelief that I had actually seen him, although I had not really, although he did not know that, of course. For a moment our eyes locked, and the creature held my gaze in a hypnotic way. His demeanour was very easygoing and non-threatening. I hasten to say that not for a moment did I feel fear. I had an inner knowing that all was well and that this creature was not a threat to me. He gave me one more glance, he took 2 strides on his long legs, and he vanished. I knew suddenly I had seen a Bigfoot, and I felt truly privileged to have had an encounter like this. It was weird that a piece of moss suddenly became a Bigfoot. I knew the loneliness and solitude of my grief had heightened my focus on all the fauna and flora around me, and only because I took some time to be quiet and still that I even got to notice that the tree was hiding the secret before my very eyes, Bigfoot himself. A day or so later I went to my secret spot where I had seen the hairy man, and I placed some bananas, apples, grapes and granola bars at the very tree where I had seen the creature. I know he got them because the next day they were gone. Every year on the same date, in memory of my dog Noah, I'm going to gift this Bigfoot under that tree with fruit and granola bars, and I'll keep you posted because maybe my story is not yet over. For all your listeners who have beloved pets, treasure them while you have them, love them and enjoy them. If they die, grieve their passing, but do not be sad for too long, because in the end of one life is the dawning of a new life. Do not be afraid of the new, and do not be afraid of loving another animal, because each creature we own will teach us so much about ourselves and make our lives ever richer for having known them. I dedicate this letter to my beloved dog Noah, who will be sorely missed, and to all your viewers' deceased pets that may be gone, but their memories still live on in us all. With lots of love to every one of your viewers. Dear Sarah and all your listeners, if you had told me 5 years ago that Bigfoots were real, I would have never believed you, not in a million years. Such an idea would seem preposterous to me. I am by nature a very cynical person who needs to have evidence before I believe in anything, but now I know differently, so the huge cynic in me has been well and truly challenged. I work in New York City as a city broker, and most of my time my schedule is hectic and overwhelming. I spend a lot of time on the computer or sitting at a desk on the phone to important clients. Sometimes I take clients out to dinner or lunch on the company, of course. I would return to my flat in New York after a day's work in the city, really feeling drained by my heavy workload because it was never ending. I was exhausted and overwhelmed by my job, and my wife insisted I visited the doctor because I was starting to experience sleeplessness and I was tossing and turning night after night. She was very worried about my health and insisted that I went to see the doctor. Begrudgingly I agreed to a medical, and the doctor told me that I was seriously overweight, that I had fatty liver disease, high blood pressure, and I was at risk of developing diabetes. I was shocked, to say the least, because I had absolutely no idea how unhealthy I had become. I knew that I had to do something about it. If you go on this way, Bob, my doctor said, you will have a heart attack before you're 40. Do you not want to be around for your kids when they've grown up? I was horrified. The doctor was telling me that if I did not get healthy soon, I might not be around for my children. That was my final wake-up call. What was the point, I thought, of a high-powered job if it was driving me into an early grave? I confided in my brother about my failing health, and he suggested I took a month off away from even my wife and kids and go on a solo retreat to stay at his newly acquired little country cabin in the woods in Pennsylvania. I had not been there before, but I did not need any persuading. I decided I would use this golden opportunity to get fit, revamp my diet, and get some well-needed rest. So that is exactly what I did, and I have never regretted that decision. When I arrived at my brother's cabin in the woods, I was amazed how remote it was. It was quite literally in the middle of nowhere, and there was no human habitation for miles around, and the nearest town was an hour away. On the first night, after chopping wood, I made a fire and sat down to a healthy meal, void of any carbohydrates, and no puddings for dessert. I hated being on a diet. It really sucked, and worse still, I was not allowed any beers, which was a real bummer, especially in such a beautiful setting like this. I retired to bed, and I was awoken to these strange sounds coming from the wood. It sounded like children's voices chattering excitedly. I did think this was odd, as there were no people around, so I do not mind admitting I was a little spooked. The whole experience seemed somewhat supernatural to me. The following morning I took my brother's mountain bike for a ride down a hiking trail, and it was a pleasant experience. But I have to admit I was huffing and puffing because I was so unfit. Eventually I got off the bike and sat down under a tree, and I was so exhausted from the physical exertion that I have to admit I fell asleep. I'm embarrassed to admit that. I awoke an hour or so later to hear these hushed chattering sounds around me, and as I opened my eyes ever so slowly, I saw these two small bipedal creatures regarding me curiously, like I was an object of great interest. I had never seen creatures like this before. They were about 2 feet in height. They had almost triangular heads with human-like faces, and they were covered in jet black hair from head to foot. They had long arms like a monkey and strong, slender legs. They looked like little monkey people to me. Truly, I do not know how else to describe them. What are they? I kept wondering to myself, and judging by the way they were looking at me, I think they were thinking exactly the same thing about me. They started chattering together excitedly because I was finally awake, and they sounded like children's voices I had heard the previous night. So this was the source of the unusual noise that I had heard the night before. Suddenly I noticed one of the creatures looking at the other intently for a second, and then they both just bolted up to the top of the tree as if they were hiding from something or someone. I looked at them, and they were at the top of the tree, and they really looked like two black blobs in the treetops. I doubt you would have noticed they were there because they were superbly camouflaged. I suddenly heard a sound, and it sounded like something bipedal, but it was heavy and it was walking through the undergrowth, but I knew at once that it was not human. My instincts warned me to run and hide, and that is exactly what I did. I took refuge behind a nearby tree and threw my mountain bike into some nearby shrubbery, hoping that it would not be detected. Then I saw her, and it was a her, because she had breasts. I knew instantly that she was the mother. I would say that she was 7 foot tall, and she was very big. Her chest area was wide, but her hips were slender, and her legs long and lean and very muscular. Her head was more cone-shaped than her kids', but her face was very human in appearance. I could see that she was walking slowly and seemed to be in no hurry. She was chewing something and focused on what she was eating. I watched her squatting under the tree and continued to eat. I realized she was eating a squirrel from the inside out. I watched her two children slide down the tree and rush to her side. Before long, all 3 of them were engaged in the squirrel feast, each taking turns to eat large mouthfuls of flesh, and they chewed loudly. It sounded like they were really enjoying their feast. The mother did sniff the air for a moment and looked around several times, and I was praying, please God, do not let her see my bicycle. She started to chatter to her children, and they responded in chattering voices, and it went on back and forth as if they were speaking in a native tongue. I watched one of the creatures climb on their mother's left shoulder, and the other little creature on her right, and she stood up and walked away with the two kids sitting on both sides of her back. I noticed she walked away with such grace and agility. It was extraordinary. I ran to the bush to retrieve my mountain bike, mounted it as quickly as I could, and cycled out there as fast as I could. I realized when I got back to the cabin that I was sweating profusely from fear. Seeing how powerful and intimidating the mother really was had set my nerves on edge, and I did wonder how things would have transpired if she had spotted me, especially with her kids around. I do think the children kept quiet about me so as not to get in trouble with their mother, because the moment they heard her coming, they fled up the tree. I think I was very lucky she did not spot me, but I'm almost sure she smelt me. Maybe she thought a human had been in the vicinity and had gone away. All I know was I was glad to be back safely in the cabin. I just made sure that I exercised from now on the dirt roads after that, and I avoided venturing in the woods again. Staying at the cabin was a welcome break. Sometimes at night I would hear the chattering noises and whooping sounds and the occasional tree knocks, but I wasn't worried because I knew the source of the noises, and providing I kept my distance, I was sure the creatures would not give me any grief, and I was right. I did get some well-needed rest, read a couple of books, stuck to my diet, and exercised a little, and in 1 month I lost 20 pounds and returned home fitter and more relaxed. Naturally, I did some research and discovered that I had encountered Bigfoots in the woods, and believe me, they are real, but I will never in a million years admit that in person for fear of being ridiculed. Hope you and your listeners enjoyed my story. Dear Sarah and all your listeners, I believe my grandfather may have had a friendship with a Bigfoot because growing up the signs were all there and I was too blind to see them, which I really regret. I was raised by my mother in a small little townhouse in Atlanta. I was born as a result of a teenage pregnancy, and I'm grateful my mother chose to keep me. It could not have been easy for her because my father absconded and never wanted to have to do anything with me. My mother would always send me to rural Kentucky during the school holidays to stay with my grandfather, and every holiday I spent with my granddad was simply wonderful. He lived on a large property of 250 acres of land with its own lake, boathouse and woods. It was every young boy's dream, and I recall countless wonderful summer holidays with him. My grandfather was an outdoorsy type of person, and he would take me canoeing on the lake, fishing, camping and exploring. I loved spending time with him because he was so easygoing, down to earth, and the kind of person that really understood animals like no one I have ever known. And whether a creature was wild or domestic, they trusted him. One year during the summer holidays, I brought my best friend Ben to stay at my granddad's house. Ben was a light sleeper, unlike myself, and so one night he woke me up, shaking my body violently. "Rex," he said, "your grandfather is up to something." "What are you talking about?" I asked him, wiping the sleep from my eyes. "He's doing some kind of Morse code downstairs." "What do you mean?" I asked. Ben took me to the bedroom window that looked across the lower living quarters of the house, and I could see the outline of my grandfather in the window, flashing his torch 3 times on, 3 times off, 3 times on, and 3 times off. It did seem very odd, to say the least. What was my grandfather up to, I wondered? Who on earth was he signalling to? I began to feel as if I was in the middle of an Enid Blyton adventure, and it was exciting for a boy of my age. Suddenly we heard 3 distinct whistles coming from the woods, followed by 3 wood knocks. Then there were 3 more whistles, 3 more wood knocks, and finally 3 whistles and 3 wood knocks. Once again my grandfather repeated his torch action 3 times off, 1 times on. Then we saw the outline of 3 huge, dark, formidable-looking shapes emerging from the woods at the back of the property. If you did not know better, You could even have thought that the beings were ghosts because of the way they almost floated across the lawn towards my grandfather with such swiftness and ease. "Boy, they look creepy," gasped Ben in horror. "Did you see the red shine coming from those creatures' eyes? Do you think your granddad is involved in the occult? These things look like devils that your grandfather has summoned. And look, one of them is carrying a deer on his shoulders." "Don't be silly," I scolded Ben. Secretly, I was wondering why my grandfather's behavior was so mysterious. What was he hiding? What did he not want us to see? And what were these strange, gargantuan, dark forms that he seemed to have summoned from the forest? Ben and I could hear excitable chattering going on as the creatures conversed with my granddad in this strange language, and I could hear my grandfather chattering back in the same tongue. Ben and I watched in amazement as these creatures finally returned to the woods in the same way that they had come. The question left us haunted because these creatures looked like the stuff that nightmares were made of, and yet my grandfather was talking to them as if they were friends. It was weird, to say the least. "I'm sorry," said Ben, "but those things, whatever they are, they look like demons." The next morning I was too cowardly to ask my granddad directly who his nightly visitors were, which all these years later I truly regret, because my grandfather was a very straightforward person, and I believe he would have told me, or I think he would have told me the whole truth. I watched my grandfather prepare a venison stew for dinner, with the deer the creatures brought him. I asked him, "Where did you get that deer?" "A friend of mine who's a hunter dropped it by last night." "I never saw him," I lied. "He's always an impromptu visitor," said my grandfather. "Why?" I asked. "Some people like to keep themselves to themselves." "Do you have to pay him for the deer?" "Of course not," laughed my father. "It was a gift." "He must be very generous," I said. "His kind are," he said, "if you treat them right." So that was one occasion for me when the dots just did not add up, and Ben and I would spend ages together discussing the strange-looking ghostly apparition-like forms that we had seen visiting my granddad. Another time I was staying at my grandfather's house, I remember he fought tooth and nail with the authorities regarding some of the forests in his area that were going to be flattened to make way for modern housing. I had never seen my grandfather angrier in his whole life. He got people to sign petitions from all over North America against destroying these vast areas of natural habitat, and he literally got millions of signatures. I do not know how he did it, but he won the case, and I'm glad to say that even all these years later, that area my grandfather fought for has not been flattened, but remains an area of protected natural beauty and abundant wildlife. I remember asking him why preserving the forest was so important to him, and he said, "Son, these forests are a natural habitat for many animals, many that you may not even know about. How would you feel if your home was being snatched away from under you?" "I would hate it," I told him. He said to me, "Some creatures don't have a voice. We need to be that voice for them. People do not truly understand animals because they do not speak their language. If they understood the way that animals feel and think, just like we do, the world would be a better place because there would be so much more compassion." After that conversation with my granddad, I stayed with him over the years for many more holidays until I finally went to university. In those days, I did not stay with him in Kentucky, but spoke to him very regularly on the phone. 20 years passed by very quickly, and in that time I got married to a wonderful woman called Allison, and we had a baby girl called Abigail together. Sadly, my mum passed away 5 years earlier due to a malignant form of breast cancer, so she never got to meet her beautiful grandchild, which is a dreadful pity. On one very sad morning in early fall, I was informed that my grandfather had died of a sudden stroke at his home. I was totally devastated, and all the memories of my childhood came flooding back. All the time I had spent with him, especially the memories of those dark forms that emerged from the woods. All these years later, I still wondered what they were. Naturally, I was the only surviving family member left to deal with all the funeral arrangements. In Kentucky, you can get buried on a family plot, and my grandfather wanted to be buried next to his deceased wife, whose gravestone had been on the family plot for over 40 years. I began to make funeral arrangements, and there were so many people who came to the service, which was conducted around an open grave. I was amazed how beloved my grandfather was, because there was not a dry eye in the house, quite literally. My wife and I invited everyone to join us for a hog roast with salads and drinks to honour the memory of my grandfather. One lady came up to me and told me how wonderful my grandfather was. Of course, she said, he knew the animals like no one else I've ever known. He could talk to them, you know, and they would talk back. What do you mean? I asked in surprise. The lady looked at me. You don't know? Know what? I asked. That everyone around here would call on your grandfather if they were having problems with an animal. He would go and see the animal and talk to it telepathically. You mean like an animal psychic? I asked. Exactly, she said. I had a cat that was not eating, and I found out that she wanted to eat in private without the dogs watching her because it made her feel uncomfortable and self-conscious. You see, I would feed them in the kitchen together. Did it work? I asked. From the moment I fed him away from those dogs, that cat started to eat at once and regained the weight that she had lost. I was so relieved, and it was all thanks to your granddad. Believe you me, I could tell you some stories of the wonderful thing that your granddad has done for animals around this area. Suddenly at the funeral gathering, I learned things about my grandfather that I had never known, and I marvelled over him from beyond the grave. Once the funeral service was over, and I was washing dishes at the kitchen sink that had a great view over our family burial plot, I noticed the signs of the early evening approaching as the light started to dissipate. It was then that I saw 3 forms coming from the woods, walking with such great grace towards my grandfather's grave. They looked very similar to the huge shapes I had seen all those years ago as a young boy. But now that it was lighter, I got a clearer view of them. I could see by the way that these creatures were gathered around my grandfather's gravesite that they were really grieving my granddad's passing. What were they, I wondered, as I watched the creatures in awe. They were all about 8 feet tall, 800 pounds, and their bodies were covered in 3-inch long black hair. They had long arms like a monkey's, only they were hugely muscular, and hands like a human, and their torso area was huge, but the legs were lean and strong. They did have human-like faces, set in cone-shaped heads. Their eyes I could not see clearly, but their noses looked flat and their lips slim. Suddenly I heard high-pitched howling sounds coming from these creatures that were so shrill it almost made my whole body vibrate. And I kid you not, the sound was terrifying, although I don't think they meant it to be that way. Finally and thankfully the howling stopped, and then for a long while they stood in silence as if they were honouring my grandfather. At face value, these creatures were terrifying and exceedingly formidable, but they clearly had a humanity to them, and I believe had a good relationship with my granddad. How that all transpired, I will never know because my grandfather never told me about it. However, from all that I've learnt about my grandfather's psychic ability with animals, I began to understand that my grandfather really did have some kind of a personal relationship with the creature that I now know to be Bigfoot. And maybe my grandfather was the one person that knew how to speak the language of the hairy man. I do hope you enjoyed the story. Thank you so very much for that lovely story. Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.